practices shown in this video can be dangerous, so don't do this at home. I do not condone any violence against people or animals, and this video is just about a fantasy scenario and only serves entertainment purposes. Welcome to the Nuclear Snail channel. This time I have this zombie apocalypse hammer with a spike for you. So this is something that I've made just out of the stuff that I had lying around at that time as a self-imposed challenge. We're also gonna do some smack tests with this. This part, that has been lying around my junk crate forever because it is just too heavy to be used in a costume, was the initial inspiration for this build. I just wanted to use it for something. So I've disassembled it, and one half of it became the head. This thing doesn't weigh a lot. It's not like a sledgehammer weight, it's really more of a warhammer weight. So I think it's pretty close to what medieval warhammers also weighed. As many of you know, warhammers weigh a lot less on the head than sledgehammers, because otherwise you can just not use them comfortably. This is, however, something that I've had to consciously keep in mind while building this thing. So that's one of the reasons why I chose the langets that are not too long and not too heavy, and also why I removed some parts of the head. Obviously also to make it sharper like a beak, but also to reduce weight. It has langets right here out of steel which hold in place this heavy hammerhead. The shaft does not go through the hammerhead. It didn't work out. This is just way too solid steel. And I already can hear some of you say, "But Dima, why don't you use welder? Welder very good tool for work with steel." And you're right. If I've had a welder, this would be exactly what I would have used to avoid a lot of the problems between the langets and the head attachment, which I will show you later in the video and we'll talk about. All of those problems would be easily solved with welding, but part of the challenge was that I do not use tools which I don't yet have. So in that regard, I actually think this build is extremely realistic. Now, one thing I would like to talk about is this part right here. So the hammer side. Obviously, as soon as this goes into a zombie skull, you are left with a counter hook right here, which makes it extremely difficult to pull it out. I wouldn't go as far as saying it will get stuck every time, but I think it would be not really something you'd want to use. So this is a lot more of a beak weapon than it is a hammer weapon. Liking the aesthetics of this a lot, and also just can't be asked to work on this anymore. But realistically, if the zombies were really coming, I would get rid of this piece so I can also use the hammer side. And this spike is, of course, the more viable part, which is why I also have the hit protection just on one side. Also just for the aesthetics of it, I like the contrast that you can still see some wood here, but here it's covered with this rubber. And this right here is some rubber from a timing belt, and it prevents some of the damage to the shaft if you miss some hits. Here is the handle. It doesn't really have a pommel to end them rightly, just this strip of belt at the end, so that I just know by feeling, even without looking, where the end of my shaft is. And the shaft doesn't have a wrapping or anything like this. It's smooth, just like on historical medieval pole arms, so you would be able to slide your arms, your hands up and down the shaft. So you can do this, and of course you can also choke it up and go close quarters like this, still using the leverage, or you could, do this, where as you move, your hand slides down, and then it's a lot of leverage. You gotta watch out not to hit stuff around here. You can see on the shaft here, we have those bolts and nuts, and those hold together the two pieces here. Because the shaft is not made out of one wood piece, because it didn't have one wood piece, so I had to improvise. This is actually viable. This would actually hold. Probably not forever, quite a couple of missions until it needs repairs. Now the part that I think it's gonna be failing at are those anti-rotational screws here, or bolts. Let's destroy stuff. Sorry about the traffic noise. So got this gift from the neighbors, some old furniture and whatever this electronic box is. So we're gonna start with that. I think, by the way, this whole construction will just collapse after a hit. Now we try this aluminum armor with some foam padding. So this is something I would usually make just for decorative purposes, and I don't think it will hold really well. By the way, this being able to fall over actually adds to the realism, because like a zombie will not be just mounted in place immovably. So here goes the aluminum armor. I think it will go right through. Well, I missed. And actually the bolts of the armor, which I didn't trim, are now stuck in the hammer. And it really bent it, but that's what you get for bad aim. Let's try that again. And this became no longer usable because it's just completely destroyed now. It's some old wood. So there it goes. Hopefully I can bend it back to shape so it still looks cool and then tells a story. Let's give it another one. And here it hit on the edge. It's nasty. Check this out. Let's give this electronics part another go. You see that here? It came out on the other side the last time we hit it. There it is, poking out the other side. There we go. And another one just for good measure. I keep overstriking. Not good. That's gonna fall. Yep. Football shoulder pad or something similar. It's raining like God knows what, so I just undressed myself and put on some sports shorts, whatever. Let's try the hammer side. Try this now. Another football shoulder piece with some sturdy plastic and some fat padding. Still a bit warmer with the tank top, even if it's wet. Another hammer time. Now watch out not to hit stuff behind me. Duh. And now we try this medieval steel piece. I don't think it will go through, but let's give it a go. Actually did go through. And obviously there are non-medieval buckles on this. This is from a LARP. But I mean, how representative the thickness of it would be to medieval armor, blah. Check out that vicious hole. And now let's just smack up this tree stump, just because. Oh yes! Just stress test the hammerhead. Oh god, the stress that goes through my fingers when moving, when hitting an immovable object like this. It's tremendous. But the tree stump is not gonna die, so I give up. So, how did the hammer fare? Especially in terms of those anti-rotational bolts loosening up. Let's see. Let's smack it into the tree stump. There we go. And let's see if we get any movement around the axis of this main bolt as we leverage it out. Nope. Completely solid. Completely undamaged. I did not actually expect that. Here's how I made it. This is the broken hook that I got off a flea market, and it's really heavy, so I open it up violently, removing one of those bolts, and then pulling out this rod which holds it to the frame. So then what we're left with are those two parts, and one of the halves is then our hammerhead. Then I consider those two steel langets for it. Later I end up using just one of them, so I cut it in half then, because two of them were excessively long and excessively heavy, most of all. The two of them weigh as much as the entire hammerhead. Considering some stupid constructions here, this would not have worked, and this might have kind of worked with this steel profile right here, but it was a bit too heavy and clunky and weird anyway, so I settled on wood. Now, since the part of the challenge I imposed on myself was working with what I had right there and then, I did not really get a nice piece of wood. Instead, I got two of those nice pieces of wood, which combined provide a shaft of nice dimensions. I apply some epoxy in order to stick them together. And then I use my marker here and use my saw to accommodate the shape of the butt to the steel, since I didn't want to mess with the steel just then, or at all, if possible. I wanted to make use of this big hole, which proved not viable later because I did not have a proper bolt and so on. So those two langets I tape and clamp together and drill with a drill bit that was too small until I finally make a hole that's big enough in order to plop through this bolt. For that I also use my file, so it was quite a bit of work just because it's really tough steel and I didn't have a proper sized drill bit. Also, this big hole in the hammerhead happened to be not in the spot that I wanted it to be in, and also, as I said, too big. So I decided to get rid of it by plopping in this luckily exactly properly sized piece of steel right into there and gluing it in place with epoxy, and then removing the excess with my metal saw, so it ends up looking like this. So I would, for example, drill right here, and then have a nice big hole here. It would all behave like one piece of metal, in theory, at least for these purposes. Spray the langets so they look cool and distressed, and also sand it down the shaft, so it's nice and smooth and has rounded corners. Smacking the shaft on the tree stump, I realized that it is not that well held together by the epoxy. It was at the back end here, but this delaminated after like 5 hits just with the shaft, so this was not good. I would come back to this later. For now I wanted to work more on the hammerhead, and I wanted to have a spike, so this is top view, so I mark it here and take my metal saw to it in order to remove this part. It was a lot of hard work. Here it is, halfway through one side. It's really tough. I have to put my entire core into it, but that speaks for the steel quality, I guess. I'm not an expert on steel qualities. And here you can see that through this side profile, the blade is visible. Pretty cool, huh? And it's about to plop off. Ah, so satisfying. And here you see I'm moving my entire body and holding the saw at both ends. As I said, it was really, really sturdy steel. And this is really rough right now, just after the cut. So I take my miniature belt sander to it and make it nice and smooth. This is a lot better. I want to make something rough and post-apocalyptic, but not that rough. Also, as far as function goes, if I want to stack it all the way into a monster skull or a zombie skull or whatever, then I need to have it smooth, and also so I don't scratch myself. I love pieces of metal. So I also wanted to have a spike a bit more beak-like, so I mark off these lines here, and also decided to remove some weight and make it easier to attach to a wooden shaft by removing this excess. So this is the shaft I actually wanted to use. It's a thick steel profile, thicker than what I've shown before, and I would put also wood inside of it to reinforce it even more, and I wanted to make a big hole here to put the hammerhead on as you would with a regular hammerhead. There would still be enough material on the sides of it to hold it in place. In fact, rather well, I believe. So I decided my odyssey of fail trying to drill it out. I broke so many drill bits, and it took me 2 days or so, or maybe like if I worked through, then maybe it would have been 1 day to drill it out to a extent which was large but not sufficient. So before I drill it, I decided to lop off that part just to reduce the weight and also to make a flat surface here instead of this cool looking but weird angle. This is what it looks like after me lopping off that part and sanding it down a bit. Then mark off where I want my hole to be, and I also do so with my punch. So the plan was to drill around with a small diameter, like 3 or 4 millimeters drill, to create a hole. And I did that after trying to make those bigger holes, which I realized pretty quickly was not going to give me the result I want. Well, this also didn't give me the result I want. You see those broken drills and all that, so I'll spare you all the dramatic details, but basically this is an incredibly tough steel, and I had the feeling that it has different densities inside of it. Like the drill bits would behave erratically inside of it sometimes. Sometimes they would go, sometimes not. Sometimes I would drill like halfway through and then it starts wobbling, then it stops wobbling again. It was all kinds of weird. I thought it's because of this central piece that I've put in before, and I hammered it out like this, so it no longer was in there. But even here, when drills went not precisely in the middle of this, or bypassing this entirely, but like here, the drill would bend sideways, be weird and all, and break. So I broke so many drill bits. I had to order these new ones, and I also broke all of them. I also tried cooling, and I tried cutting oil and all that. In this clip you can see me cooling the drill bit with this nice piece of metal cut by the new sharp bit, but the bits would deteriorate enormously fast. At some point I gave up and decided to just throw every tool I had at it, including this Dremel, and I hacked into it like a madman. At this point I was just raging. But it didn't bring me anywhere. I mean, it looks like Swiss cheese now, but I still couldn't make a decent hole there. And at that point was when I realized I'm not attaching anything this way. So back to the wooden shaft it was. For that I use those profiles. Those are drywall connectors, and you might say, oh, that's a flimsy profile, but it has this buff 3D profile here, which makes it pretty tough actually. I don't know if it would be viable for like months in the field slaying zombies, but it was definitely not the part that failed. So here I'm considering how to attach it. I wanted to have this part right over this hole nicely and visually aesthetic. Before that I wanted to secure the hammerhead to the shaft with a belt. For that I round off the edge of the hole so it wouldn't deteriorate the belt, and here you can see the belt, so I would attach it to the shaft and then put it through that existing hole. So it would act as a sort of security. If those langets fail, I would not have my hammerhead just flying around. And then I drilled some 3mm holes in there to put 3mm bolts through. Yes, this is extremely flimsy, and it did go exactly as expected. So I want the holes here and here and here to attach the halves to each other, and I want holes here, here, and here, not colliding with those other holes, to attach the langets to the shaft. I also used this piece of rubber timing belt from a car to attach it to where a lot of missed strikes would go, and it actually works pretty well for that. Not as good as steel probably, but still pretty nice. Chose 4mm bolts for this, for attaching the two halves together, and here you can see the process. So I'm just plopping everything together, already drilled the holes here, and that's what it looks like when I'm done with that in the top part. This area here is empty so that my hands can slide up and down the shaft. Later on I would also add some bolts in that area, but I would make them flush. That's what it looks like with just the belt, without the langets yet, and now I attach the langets using those 3mm holes I drilled before. So it looks like this, which is really cool looking. And then I add some additional belts around, both for general sturdiness and looks. And now I want to fill those holes which are in that wood from some previous projects it was used for, and is compromising stability. So for that I use my axe to split a small piece of wood. I didn't have something smaller than an axe. And I use some glue, and I put the glue into the holes, and then I stick in and hammer in those wooden rods in there, and let it dry, and then I also send them off to be flush again. I also used that glue in between the langets and the hammerhead in hopes that it would make it more stable, and the stress would go not just on those two small bolts. It did not work at all. It might have worked with epoxy, at least for a while, but I didn't try that. So really drown it in glue basically. And then I also dust it with Mr. B here, so that it looks nice and dusty on all the parts that were still sticky and drying. I mean, it looks pretty neat. I also use bolt adhesive in order to prevent the bolts from opening on their own. It's really nice. I like this profile, I like this aesthetically. But after some usage, here is what happened. Like after 10 smacks, the langet just sheared off, just chopped off, decapitated that bolt. Because it's a small flimsy bolt. Like, what did you expect? What did I expect? So I add those thicker bolts, 4mm this time, which made it a bit sturdier, but it still was feeling kind of flimsy. Like not really sturdy. It was feeling like a weapon from Dying Light, where you smack 10 zombies and then you have to repair it. So I decided to drill out this big hole and somehow maybe fill that hole with epoxy or whatever, and some other filler to make a composite filling, and put in that big bolt there to hold all that stuff together with a big piece of metal. So I drill out this hole with a large drill, ruining the belt in the process entirely. And yes, I can stick the bolt through, and then I was also able to tighten it, at which point I was like, this looks cool, but this still isn't sturdy by a long stretch. This is not gonna work. Alright, I could have left it like this. It looks halfway convincing. I mean, to someone who doesn't really understand a lot about this kind of stuff and weapon building and medieval weapons and all that, it does look convincing. And I believe this would kill a bunch of zombies, but it was not really up to my self-imposed challenge standard. I wanted it to be, if not indestructible, then at least like really sturdy. This was like kinda a bit sturdy. So just disassemble the whole thing and use my knife to remove all this gunk, which looks really nice by the way, but that would have been messing with the langets which I was about to add. So this is after cleaning up, and I plopped in back this metal piece again and drill it out. And since I didn't have drills that were big enough, I had to like stick it in and wiggle it around, which is not just dangerous, it's also creating a conic hole, which is slimmer in the center and broader on the ends, which would have not been a nice solid hold. So instead I use hardwood. This is a rod of hardwood, actually the shaft of a brush. And man, was this wood hard. Drilling it was a lot easier than drilling that metal. And by the way, I broke a bunch of drills drilling that metal too. And then I took like 20 to 30 minutes really to file it down with my file. That's how sturdy that wood is, don't underestimate it. Finally, I have a hole that is the right size, considering other langets here, but nah. Used this butt plate here made out of aluminum and just stuck there with some double-sided adhesive tape to prevent damage to the butt of the shaft. That's what it looks like, so the hammerhead's bottom would rest against this. And as I would move, you see here, this force would apply. Of course, less obvious than this. This would apply, and this has bent and damaged the butt here on the wood before, so this plate is there to prevent it. The langets, I chopped them in half, so I chopped one of them in half, and then after this shot, I duplicated the hole, and also added 3 holes on each side here to attach it to the shaft. Here's the big drill and the bolt, and this also took a lot of time, yet again. Like, this was so much shorter, and I actually burned my drill doing it. It was smoking. So I took a new drill, or better to say an old one, from the drawer, where those old drills live. And finally, after another 10 or 20 minutes of cluster clock, I'm able to put this bolt through. This is what it looks like without the langet yet. All the holes already drilled, this one is too much. Didn't care about it at this point. Using some of that glue I shown before, probably overkill because I already was using some of that double-sided adhesive tape here shown still with a masking tape, so this is the langet. And when it would be pressed to the shaft, any rotation between those would be very, very difficult. Because double-sided adhesive tape, when pressed between 2 surfaces and then you try to slide those 2 surfaces relative to each other, that is very sturdy. So this is the langets attached, and this is already a pretty decent metal-covered club here. Talking about the langets, it would have been better if they were slimmer, but at the same time longer, so like up until here. Because this is where also that rubber buffer ends, and it ends there because I've decided that I don't want my hand necessarily to be further up the shaft than there. On medieval polearms, they would sometimes have a lot longer langets, which would be sunk into the wood, so there would be a groove in the wood, and the langet would be then flush, which of course is a sturdier attachment, because just so much more of the wood is then connected to the steel, and the langet also protects all that length of the wood then. They wouldn't go like all the way down, at least I don't think, but a lot further than here. But then again, I had what I had here, so with this strip of steel, which I really didn't want to saw lengthwise, I've chosen just to shorten it like this, so it's not too heavy. It was handling pretty well too, but I wanted this brutal hammer, of course. So I continued on with that, hammering in this bolt in here, and then using a ton of force, using this pipe clamp or pipe wrench. Pipe wrench, that's what it is, not a clamp. And at that point, that is the biggest part of it, of what makes it as sturdy as it is. Not saying it's super sturdy though, because after testing it by slamming it into this wood stump, which is used for chopping wood, so it's a really sturdy wood stump, I realized this is happening. So at this point, that's because that's a single pivot point going on here. And also the butt is not touching it as closely as I would like to, but at this point I can't fix it, because for that I would need to enlarge those holes just a bit, which would make them just too big in general, and the langet would shift back and forth. This was no good, so I had to do something. So what I did after removing the excess from the bolts is I added this small bolt through one of the holes that I had before from those fancy langets. So for that I used my drill foot to remove a half circle of this sturdy steel langet right here, which was another bit of cluster clock, but eventually I succeeded putting it in. That prevents the rotation a bit, and I also added another hole here through everything, through both of the langets and through the hammerhead, again breaking a couple of drills in the process. That is what it looked like then. You see those 2 bolts. And they do prevent rotation. I just don't know how long they will hold. Probably not forever. I mean, it's certainly a lot better than the construction before, but this is not indestructible. Now, this is the shaft, the part of it where the hands slide, and that was not pressed against each other yet, so it would give a wonky feeling where it's like moving around just a tiny bit, so really insecure feeling. I use this countersink here just by hand in order to create a countersink hole for those 4mm countersink screws. Bolts. I keep saying screws, they're bolts. On the opposite side, I just also use the countersink, but into that hole I hammer in this nut, so it's flush. So this is the nut right here. And the hole for the bolt itself that goes through the wood is obviously the inner diameter of the nut. And this is what it looks like when finished, so cut off after bolting it together, and also sand it with the belt sander, so that it's flush. And I mean, I can feel those still when sliding up and down the shaft, but they don't hinder me doing it at all, and in fact, it's actually better because I just feel where my hands are on the shaft. So after that, I sand down the whole shaft to make it smooth. See those impressions, those indentations from the vise from the previous steps? Pretty cool, I kept those. So for sanding it down, I use different grits of sandpaper, so a rougher sandpaper right here, a less rough sandpaper here, and later on, this polishing fleece. And I use a wet piece of kitchen towel here to just make it damp and let it dry, raising the fibers as it dries, and allows you to sand them off, making it smooth. I repeat this process 2 times here, should have worn gloves. So sanding it down, making it damp again, sanding it down, with decreasing grits of sandpaper. So rough, middle rough, and then just this polishing fleece then. And then also I applied 2 coats of this wood stain fluid. So it says to let it dry for 12 hours. I did just 3 because I'm impatient. And then I use some acrylic paint, which is diluted with water, on my brush in order to create this nice, a bit aged effect here, and just add some dirt. And this is a letter punch. I have a video showing how to use them on metal, but here I'm using it in hardwood to punch in my character's name. And then I also use those stamps, which I use for everything, add some decals to the wood to make it look like the wood was scavenged from something that used to have a different purpose before. So just a bit subtle storytelling added. And at the end I add this one stencil right here, because it was the proper size and all that, so it just really brings the whole visual composition together here, without being too present, although it's obviously, as far as stencils go, the most present one in here. And then I use some sandpaper on the metal parts, just slightly, to give them a bit of buff and all that. And also, as the last step, what I did on that shaft is just rub it down with dry kitchen towels for 10 minutes or so, basically polishing it where my hands would go. So I hope this video was interesting and entertaining to you. I'll see you in the next episode. Until then, hail the snail. If you're a regular viewer, subscribe to... support me on Patreon. It's the first link in the video description. It's especially important now in the Corona crisis times to stay afloat. And also check out the Nuclear Snail community group. It's also linked in the video description. See you.